Wyoming Territory, August 1872, the last wagon disappeared over the dry ridge, and Frankie Norwood stood alone in the choking dust, staring after it with her lips cracked and trembling. Her bonnet hung limp in her hand, and her skirts were streaked with sweat and grit. They had not even looked back. Not her uncle, not the preacher's wife, not even the driver who had promised to wait while she stepped behind the rocks to be sick. The train had moved on without her just like that. She was 22, with no horse, no water, and no idea where the next town might be. Her legs buckled and she dropped to her knees in the dirt. The sun pressed down like a weight. She had nothing but the small satchel on her shoulder and the clothes she wore. Her mouth was dry, her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She tried to stand again, but her legs wouldn't listen. A faint sound of hooves stirred the silence. She looked up, shielding her eyes. A man on horseback crested the ridge, tall in the saddle, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, a rifle slung across his back. Dust rose around him as he slowed, scanning the rocky ground until his eyes landed on her. He rode down slow, careful, his gaze steady but not unkind. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid movement and walked the last few steps. "You all right?" His voice was low, quiet, with a roughness that caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. He crouched beside her. "Name's Merritt McAllister. You with the wagon train that just passed through?" She nodded, eyes burning. "They left me." He looked toward the ridge, then back at her. "You hurt?" "No, just—" She swallowed, voice hoarse. "They thought I was on another wagon. I stepped away for a minute." Her voice broke. "They did not even notice I was gone." Merritt watched her a moment, then stood without a word, unhooked his canteen, and handed it to her. She drank too fast and coughed, but he waited, arms crossed, eyes patient. "You got anyone on that train?" he asked after a moment. "No," she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "I was traveling with my uncle's family. He took me in after my parents died of fever, but he never wanted me, said I was too much trouble." Her fingers tightened on the canteen. "They just left." Merritt let out a breath through his nose, slow and quiet. Then he untied the reins of his horse and held them out to her. "You ride her, I will walk," she blinked. "I cannot take your horse," Merritt shrugged. "I am not leaving you out here." The horse, an old bay mare with kind eyes, nickered softly, nudging her shoulder. Frankie hesitated, then looked up at Merritt. He was young, maybe 28, with sunburnt skin and dark blonde hair that curled slightly at the collar. His face was serious, but not cold. The kind of face that had seen things and kept going anyway. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "North. About 20 miles to a place called Dry Creek, not much more than a trading post and a few cabins." He looked at her again. "You can come with me, get a roof over your head, food. Figure out what comes next." Frankie felt something shift in her chest. She had no reason to trust him, but something in his stance, in the quiet certainty of his voice, made her believe she could. She nodded. "All right." Merritt helped her into the saddle without a word. He adjusted the stirrups and handed her the reins. "She is calm, but if you need to stop, just pull gently. I will be right here." They set off together, the sun arcing low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry earth. Merritt walked beside her horse, one hand resting on the saddle, his steps steady and sure. Neither of them spoke for a while. After a mile, she asked, "You always help strangers in the middle of nowhere." He glanced up at her. "Only the ones who look like they have been chewed up by the world and left behind." She laughed, surprised by the sound. It felt rusty, like it had not been used in months. "That sounds about right." He smiled, but only faintly, and kept walking. They stopped to rest when the sun dipped low. Merritt started a small fire, pulled jerky and dried apples from his saddlebag, and handed her half. She ate slowly, watching his hands as he worked. They were large, calloused, and rough from years of labor. She wondered what kind of life he had lived out here. "You live in Dry Creek?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Not anymore, just passing through. I was headed north to see about some work. I do cattle drives in the warm months. Winter I trap or haul freight." She looked at the fire. "So you live alone, for now?" She nodded, then hesitated. "Thank you for stopping." "For not leaving me there." Merritt looked at her, his eyes steady. "You should not have been left in the first place." The quiet between them softened, a thread pulling tight and warm. She felt it settle in her chest, a strange comfort in the middle of nowhere. That night she slept wrapped in his blanket while he kept watch by the fire. When she stirred near dawn, she saw him sitting with his back against a stone, rifle near his hand, eyes on the horizon. "Did you sleep?" she whispered. He shook his head once. "You needed it more." She blinked slowly, her heart warming in her chest. By the time they reached Dry Creek late the next afternoon, Frankie had sunburn on her cheeks and dust in her throat, but she felt steadier. Merritt led the horse through the scattered cabins and nodded toward a low building with a tin roof. "That is the post. I will get us a meal and ask about a room." She dismounted slowly, her legs stiff. Merritt was at her side in a second, steadying her. "You all right?" she nodded. "Just tired." His hand lingered a moment at her elbow, then he stepped back. Inside the post they ate stew and bread. Merritt kept glancing at her like he was checking if she was still holding together. Afterward, he led her to a small cabin just past the edge of town. "Old man Langley keeps it for travelers. You can stay here a few days." "I will be around if you need anything." Frankie stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "You are leaving?" His jaw tightened. "Only if you want me to." She held his gaze a long time, then shook her head. "No, I do not." Merritt exhaled, long and slow. "Then I will be here." She stepped inside the cabin, but before closing the door, she looked back at him. "You saved me, Merritt." His voice was quiet. "No, I just gave you my horse." But she saw the way he looked at her, like he had found something worth staying for. And for the first time in a long while, Frankie felt like maybe she had not been left behind after all. The wind came down from the hills that night, dry and restless, tugging at the loose shutters of the cabin. Frankie folded her skirt beneath her as she eased down onto the cot, its wool blanket scratchy against her arms. She hadn't undressed, couldn't quite bring herself to settle. Something in her chest kept ticking like a clock wound too tight. Outside, a horse nickered. She rose and opened the door just enough to see Merritt in the shadows beyond the porch, crouched near the mare, checking her hooves by lantern light. He moved with slow care, his hat tilted low against the wind. She stepped onto the porch with bare feet, arms crossed against the chill. "You don't have to stay out here," she said. Merritt looked up, brushing dust from his hands. "She threw a shoe sometime today. I've got a spare in my saddlebag, but I'll have to fix it proper in the morning." Frankie leaned against the post. "You always take care of your animals like that." He stood and stretched his back. "They've carried me farther than most folks ever tried." She watched the way he rolled his shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat at his collar. He didn't fill silence with words. That suited her fine. "You ever think of settling?" she asked after a moment. Merritt hesitated before answering. "Once, back when I thought you needed land and a house to be a man." "What changed?" He glanced toward the dark hills. "Turns out land can be taken. A house burns easy. What you carry in your gut, that's harder to lose." Frankie looked down at her hands. The moonlight made pale maps of her veins. "I've never owned anything worth holding on to." Something in his face shifted, just a flicker, but he stepped up onto the porch beside her. "You've got your name." "That's something, I suppose, doesn't buy me bread." "No, but it tells a story." She met his eyes. "What's yours tell?" Merritt's jaw worked a moment before he answered. "That I've outlived more than I should have. And that I don't make promises I can't keep." The wind picked up, fluttering the edge of her sleeve. She didn't move. "I should let you sleep," he said, hand brushing the brim of his hat. "Will you be here in the morning?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I said I would be." She nodded and stepped back inside. By mid-morning, the sky had settled into a pale blue, the clouds burned off by sun and wind. Frankie walked with Merritt to the smithy near the edge of town. The blacksmith, a broad woman with soot-streaked arms and a steady hammer hand, nodded when Merritt explained the shoe. "She'll be right in a day or so," the woman said. "You can stable her out back." Merritt handed over a coin and led the mare around, then returned to find Frankie studying the street. A freight wagon clattered past, drawn by two tired oxen. A boy ran behind it, kicking dust. "I don't think I'm meant for towns," she murmured. "You don't have to be," Merritt said. "Some folks just pass through." They walked on, away from the main road, down a slope that opened into a shallow draw. Willows lined a narrow stream, the water low but clear. Merritt crouched by the bank and washed his hands. Frankie stayed behind him, watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt. After a while, he said, "You could stay here. Find work at the post, maybe take in laundry. Folks don't ask many questions." She knelt beside him, dipping her fingers into the cool water. "Is that what you think I should do?" "I think you should do what gives you peace." Frankie looked at him then, really looked. "And what gives you peace, Merritt McAllister?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin, opening it to reveal a folded scrap of paper. She watched as he smoothed it flat against his knee. "My brother," he said quietly, "died 3 years ago, shot south of Cheyenne. This was the last thing he wrote me." She didn't ask to read it, just sat beside him, her hand resting on the dry grass. "You're not alone," she said softly, "even if it feels that way." Merritt folded the paper again, slow and careful. "Maybe not now." They sat in silence, the stream whispering at their feet. Somewhere across the hills, a hawk cried. Back at the cabin that night, she lit the lantern herself. The air smelled of pine smoke and iron dust. Merritt had gone back to the smithy to check on the mare and hadn't returned yet. She didn't pace, didn't sit, just stood in the doorway and waited. When he came back, he held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a new pair of leather gloves, small but strong, stitched. "I noticed your hands were raw from the rains," he said. "Figured you'd need these if you're coming with me." She looked up sharply. "You mean that?" "I don't offer things I don't mean." Frankie turned the gloves over in her hands, then stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "If I go with you, where does that road lead?" Merritt's eyes didn't waver. "Wherever we wanted to." And for the first time since she'd been left behind, she didn't feel like a burden someone had forgotten. She felt chosen. The next morning broke quiet and gold-washed, the kind of morning that made the air taste like dust and sun-warmed sage. Merritt stood by the fence rail outside the cabin, running a whetstone down the length of his knife. The rhythmic scrape and drag of it settled something in him. Across the clearing, Frankie stepped out with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a battered tin basin filled with water from the post's well. Her eyes caught his, steady now, not hollow like they'd been. "You know how to mend fabric?" Merritt asked without looking up. "Yes," she said, kneeling by the stump where she'd laid out her needle roll. "Why?" He nodded toward his saddlebag, still bearing a tear from weeks back. "Canvas split down the side, I've patched it twice, doesn't hold." She opened the bag, felt the worn edge between her fingers. "You stitched against the grain," she said. "Didn't know canvas had a grain." She smiled, not mocking. "It does." They worked without speaking for a while, her fingers quick and sure, his blade gleaming in the sun. A pair of crows called overhead, circling out past the ridge. The sound of them tugged at something in Frankie's chest. "I used to feed birds outside my parents' window," she said, not looking up. "Even when there was barely enough to eat, I'd save a bit of bread." Merritt paused in his sharpening. "They teach you that?" "No," she answered. "I just liked the way they came back, no matter what." He turned the knife in his hand, thinking. "I never stayed anywhere long enough to see if anything would come back." She tied off her thread and held up the mended bag. "That'll hold through another season." He took it, brushing his thumb over the stitch. "Good work." Frankie stood, brushing her hands clean. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what's next." Merritt waited. "I don't want to stay here," she said, "not just because it's small or quiet. It's that I feel like I stopped moving the minute we arrived." "You're not meant to stop," he said. She narrowed her eyes at him. "You don't know that." "I do," he replied. "It's in the way you watch the horizon, like it's speaking to you." She exhaled, slower than before. "If I asked to ride with you, help with whatever work you take up next, would you let me?" He met her gaze. "If you ride with me, then we ride together. Not behind, not beside, with—" She nodded once. "Then I'm asking." Merritt looked toward the foothills, where the land started to rise in long, dry waves. "There's a ranch up past the river forks. A friend runs it. He needs hands through fall. I was thinking of heading that way. Would he take me on too?" "He'll take who I say." Frankie crossed her arms. "I don't want a favor." "You wouldn't be," he said. "You'd be working, same as me." That settled it. She turned back toward the cabin. "Then I'll start packing." By afternoon, they'd gathered what little they had. Frankie had secured her belongings into the mended saddlebag, along with a length of twine, flint, and a bone-handled fork she'd found near the well. She carried them like they mattered, not because they were valuable, but because she'd chosen them herself. Merritt watched her check the girth on the mare, adjusting the strap with competent hands. "You ever set a snare?" he asked as they mounted. "No," she said, swinging into the saddle. "But I can learn," he nodded. "We'll camp 2 nights out, I'll show you then." They rode east, where the land dipped into dry riverbeds and cottonwood groves. The road was little more than a pair of wagon ruts, but Merritt knew the turns by heart. Around the second bend, they passed a field of charred stumps what had once been someone's homestead. Frankie didn't ask about it. At dusk, they came to a low ridge above a stream. Merritt dismounted first, checking the bank for tracks. "Good water, no cattle have come through," he said. "We'll stop here." Frankie gathered deadfall while he dug a shallow pit for the fire. When she returned, arms full of kindling, he'd already set stones around the edges. She crouched beside him, laying twigs with care. "Why'd your friend settle near the river forks?" she asked as they built the fire together. "Fenced water, high pasture, good grazing," he said. "But mostly it's where his wife wanted to be buried." Frankie's fingers stilled. "How long ago?" 6 years, he said. He never remarried. She didn't press. Instead, she struck the flint, and the spark caught. Later, as they sat beside the fire with coffee in tin cups, Frankie watched the flames curl around the blackened wood. "My mother used to say fire only listens when you're quiet," she murmured. Merritt turned toward her. What else did she say? That a woman's strength isn't in her voice but in her hands. He glanced at her fingers wrapped around the cup. She was right. Frankie met his gaze. "What about your mother?" Merritt's jaw moved, but he didn't speak for a moment. "She died when I was 14, pneumonia. My father buried her under a cottonwood and drank himself numb for a year after." She didn't respond with pity, just reached out, slow and certain, and laid her hand on his knee. It stayed there, steady as stone, until the fire settled into coals. When they lay down beneath the stars, he rolled out his bedroll beside hers, close but not touching. She turned her head toward him in the dark. "I'm not afraid of being alone," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But you don't have to be anymore." They lay quiet after that, and when the wind came down through the willows again, it didn't feel like something trying to move them on. It felt like something wrapping around them, gentle and sure. They reached the ranch by late afternoon on the third day, the sun dipping just enough to throw long, amber shadows across the dry grass. The land opened up around them, not wild like the hills behind, but shaped by hands, split rail fences, rows of wind-bent cottonwoods, a corral where a few rangy cattle stood flicking their tails slow and steady. The house sat low and broad, its porch shaded with smoke curling from the chimney. Merritt led the mare forward without hesitation, reins loose in his hand. Frankie rode beside him, dust on her boots and a cramp in her legs, but her posture held straight. She hadn't spoken since they'd crossed the last creek, but her eyes never left the horizon until the house came into view. A man stepped out to meet them, his walk stiff from years in the saddle, shirt tucked raggedly into worn suspenders. His hair was gray around the edges, but his face still carried the sharpness of a man who expected answers faster than most were willing to give. "Didn't think I'd see you back this way," the man said, eyeing Merritt. Merritt dismounted, nodding once. "You said you'd need hands by fall." "I did, and you brought 2. His gaze shifted to Frankie without pause. "She ride as good as you." "I ride better when I'm not saddle sore," Frankie said before Merritt could speak. The man's mouth twitched like it might have turned into a grin, but didn't. "Name's Eb. I run this place since my brother passed. House has 2 spare rooms. One's yours, Merritt. The other's the tack shed if she's stubborn." "I'll take the shed if it means I earn my place," Frankie said. Eb nodded once. "Fair enough." They unsaddled in silence. Merritt moved with easy familiarity, hanging tack on the corral rail while Frankie carried the saddle blanket to dry on the fence. The animals were led to water, and by the time the sun kissed the far ridge, Eb had handed her a pair of work gloves and pointed at a stack of half-cured fence posts. "You know how to strip bark?" he asked. "With a draw knife," she said, already reaching for one. He watched her work the blade into the first post, testing the grain. "Don't cut yourself, you'll be no good to me bleeding." She didn't answer, just worked until her breath came hard and even. Merritt found her out there as dusk took the light. He leaned against the post pile, arms crossed, watching her hands move. "How's the shoulder?" he asked. "Tight," she said, not pausing. "I've got salve in my pack, arnica and bear grease, it'll help." She stopped then, setting the blade aside. "You make it yourself," traded for it from a woman near Fort Laramie. She said it keeps scars from puckering. Frankie wiped her arm on her sleeve. "I don't mind scars, they remind you what you survived," he nodded. Still, no harm in healing cleaner. She stepped toward him, slow from the ache in her joints, and took the tin without another word. Their fingers brushed just once. Later, after the supper, Eb cooked a stew that tasted like dried venison and onions stored too long. Frankie sat on the porch steps, her back to the post. Merritt settled beside her, his knee close enough to feel the heat from her leg. "They'll expect you to keep to yourself," he said quietly. "Why? Because you're not from here. Because you're a woman with no people. Out here, that's enough to make folks cautious." She looked out at the darkened corral. "I'm not interested in their approval, just their respect. You'll earn it," he said. "You already did with Eb." He doesn't talk much, but he sees straight. Frankie turned toward him. "What about you? What about me? Do you see straight?" Merritt's voice was low. "I see clear enough to know what's in front of me now is worth staying for." She didn't move, didn't speak. He went on, quieter still. "I've kept moving most my life, first out of necessity, then out of habit, but when I saw you on that ridge, something shifted, like I'd been riding toward something without knowing it." Frankie looked down at her hands. "I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to." "Not now," she nodded. "Good." But something in her had changed, not softened exactly but allowed room for something else, not hope, not yet, but the shape of it. They sat that way until the night took the last of the light, neither one reaching out, neither one needing to just yet. The space between them held steady. And in that quiet, Frankie felt something she hadn't since before the fever took her family. She felt safe. Not because she was protected, but because she was seen. The first frost came quiet, slipping in overnight and laying a silver film across the grass, the corral rails, and the brittle leaves clinging to the cottonwoods. Frankie stepped out of the tack shed at dawn, breath clouding, arms wrapped tight around herself. The air smelled of cedar smoke and frozen dirt. The horses stood still and haloed in mist, their flanks steaming. Merritt was already in the paddock, adjusting the yoke on the hay sledge. She joined him without a word, taking one end of the rope and helping to drag the feed through the stiff grass. They worked without speaking, the only sound the crunch of frost underfoot and the low snort of waiting animals. When the hay was laid out, Merritt leaned on the rail and looked toward the hills. A group of mule deer moved along the far slope, just silhouettes against the pale morning sky. "You ever hunted elk?" he asked. "No," Frankie said. "Never had reason." "I was thinking," he said after a pause, "if we put up enough meat now, we won't have to take any work over winter. Eb's got a smokehouse. We could salt and hang what we don't eat." She watched the deer disappear into the brush. "You saying you want to stay through winter?" "I'm saying I don't see a reason to leave." Frankie turned toward him, brows drawn. "You sure?" He met her eyes. "I've been sure of very few things in my life." "But you that steady." The wind shifted, sharper now. She reached for her gloves. "All right," she said. "Then we'll stay." That afternoon, Eb handed Frankie a basket of seed and pointed her toward the henhouse. "You know how to tell when a bird's gone broody?" he asked. "No, but I'll figure it out." He gave a short grunt that might have been approval, then walked off to check the fencing. Inside the coop, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of feathers and straw. She crouched beside a low nesting box and gently reached beneath the hen. The bird fussed but didn't peck. Frankie smiled to herself. When she stepped back out into the yard, Merritt was splitting kindling near the shed, sleeves rolled, arms moving with rhythm. She watched him for a moment, the way he paused between strikes, adjusting his stance with quiet patience. "You always work like that?" she asked, setting the basket down. "Like what?" "Like the wood's not your enemy," he glanced over. "No sense in swinging wild. You get more done if you respect the grain." She stepped closer. "You think that's true of people too?" He set down the hatchet. Sometimes, but not everyone's willing to be read. I am, she said. Merritt straightened slowly. Yeah, I know. That night they cooked supper over the fire pit behind the shed. Eb had gone to town to trade for flour and would be gone overnight. The sky stretched endless above them, filled with stars, the curve of the moon just catching the edge of the hills. Frankie stirred the beans gently, adding a pinch of the salt Merritt had bartered for weeks ago. She handed him a tin plate, their fingers brushing. He didn't look away. I used to think settling meant giving up, meant smallness. And now I think it just means choosing someone to be still with. Frankie shifted closer, her shoulder against his. I've never been anyone's choice before. Merritt turned, hand resting light on her knee. Then let me be the first to say it plain. I want to build something with you, not just pass time. She didn't answer with words, just leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed him. It was unhurried, certain. When she pulled back, she kept her forehead against his. I want that too, she whispered. The weeks that followed turned cold, then colder. Snow came in fits, laying soft over the roof and fields, but the cabin stayed warm. They hunted together, packed meat with salt, hung it high in muslin sacks. She learned to tan hides while he carved new handles for the kitchen tools. They fell into rhythm as if it had always been there. Eb gave them the main house once he decided to winter in town with his sister. Better use than letting it sit cold, he said gruffly, handing Merritt the key. On the morning Merritt carried her trunk into the front room, Frankie stood in the doorway, watching the light spill across the floorboards. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, folded square of muslin. I never had anything worth saving, she said, placing it on the mantel. But it's from my mother's dress. She wore it the day she married my father. Merritt stepped beside her, his hand finding hers. Then it belongs here. They slept in the upstairs room, the one with the slanted ceiling and the small window that faced east. The quilts were heavy, the air always carrying a trace of wood smoke. Their days were full of small things, mending, baking, reading aloud from the books Eb left behind. And their nights were quiet, filled with hands that held and arms that stayed. By the time the first thaw came, the land softening underfoot and the horses shedding their winter coats, Frankie stood in the doorway again, this time with a hand resting lightly on her belly. Merritt looked up from the porch rail, eyes catching hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He crossed to her in 2 steps and wrapped his arms around her, pressing his cheek to her hair. You sure? He asked, voice low. She nodded, eyes damp. I am. He held her tighter. Then we'll raise them right, here, together. And they did. The seasons turned, and the house filled with new sounds, laughter, small feet on wood floors, the creak of rocking chairs late into the night. Merritt built a second crib when the twins came, and Frankie taught them how to read the sky before they could even write their names. They grew old there, not fast, but steadily. Wrinkles came, hair silvered, but the fire never dimmed between them. And every year, when the frost came quiet again, Frankie would step out with her shawl wrapped tight and look toward the hills, where once, long ago, a stranger had walked up out of the dust and offered her a place to begin. She never forgot. And neither did he. They had built a life that held.